Greetings. In this video, I'm going to be talking about our new schedule and how to read it, and basically make sure that you don't fall behind in this course. I will briefly touch upon take-at-home exam number 1. I will expand on proctoring because remember, you are required to have a proctor for this class, and our first proctored exam is next week, Tuesday, May 28th. So we want to just make sure that you have a plan of action for your proctoring. But finally, the point of this video is I'm also going to give a brief tutorial on how to factor. So I will show you how to use the AC table method, which works every single time and is recommended for students that don't know how to factor or are not very good at factoring. But even if you do know how to factor, I will be teaching you the verbal method as well, which is basically just a way for us to say out loud the problem and come up with the factors that we need very quickly. So even if you do know how to factor, this could be something that could be very useful for you. The first thing we want to do is talk about our new schedule. So when we log on to our Blackboard page, we will now be taken immediately to this page, which is exam number 2 schedule. So as we move through the course, this will also change. So when we move into exam number 3, you'll be taken to the exam number 3 schedule. When we move into exam number 4 schedule, etc. At the top of each one of our exam schedules, you will have all of the sections that will be covered by this exam. So here we can see this is a list of all of the sections that you're going to need to know for our exam coming up, and then list the due date and how it is taken. So you can see here our due date is in fact Tuesday, May 28th, and this is a proctored exam, which means you are required to use a proctor or else you cannot take this exam and you would receive a 0. The other thing that we're going to see here on this schedule is that I give you some guardrails, kind of how not to fall behind in this class. So let's go ahead and read what you were supposed to do yesterday for Monday. Here, this is all about the polynomial and factoring review. For this exam, you will need to know how to work with polynomials and you will need to know how to factor. In fact, you are supposed to already know these skills coming into the class, but I understand that we don't all have that. Some of us haven't taken a math class in a long time, maybe we forgot, or maybe some of us literally just don't know how to factor at all. So what you need to do is just make sure that if you fall under that category, that you read through this, look at all of the sections that are going to be offered for you, and there's a lot of them here to get ready for your factoring. I even give you a couple of worksheets that I made myself. One is called the greatest common factor, and again, when we factor, the very first thing you must do is pull out a greatest common factor if you can. And then I also give you a basic factoring worksheet, which gives you a step-by-step guide on how to work through the AC table method, if that is the method that you think you will use. Underneath, we will always talk about the corresponding ebook readings, and because we're supposed to be covering a very vast review, that's why you see so many pieces here. So all of this information is here for you if you need to learn how to factor. Underneath, we will find all of the corresponding lecture videos, and this will be found under Module 2 lecture videos. And again, we can see there's a pretty large list because factoring is a very large topic that you're already supposed to know. At the very bottom, we will always talk about graded assignments, so anything that has a due date that will be graded, you will see down here below. So you can see, even though these sections are all about factoring, we do have 2 WebAssign homeworks that are going to be assigned to this. So the first one is sections 11.1 to 11.4. That's not 4 different assignments. That's actually just 4 topics crammed into one assignment. And then we also have section 11.5, which is going to be solving quadratic equations by factoring. These are all skills that you are supposed to know before you even come into this class. So please make sure that you are well versed on these topics. All right, so let's actually go to something that's going to be more traditional for an everyday come to the schedule, look to see what you have to do. So here, let's take a look at section 12.1a and 12.1b, simplifying, multiplying, and dividing rational expressions. So I'm going to break down these topics into days. So what you should do is each day come and take a look at the topics, and then once you complete those topics, for that day, you know you will not fall behind as long as you, and what we see here at the top is there is a this should be started no later than, and then I give a date. This is when you should start looking at these topics, learning them, and getting notes for these topics. This is the last day that you should be looking at this. So here it would make sense that right after our first exam, you should have been looking at our review, and it's going to take a while for some of those students to catch up with the review. That's why I'm saying here, you should start this lesson no later than Wednesday, May 22nd. Now, that doesn't mean you have to. This is just a suggestion. So underneath, we have simplifying, multiplying, and dividing rational expressions. I give you all the material information, and this is literally what I'm calling the don't want to fall behind topic schedule, because if you follow this schedule, you will be on time for the end of the class. Remember, this is an accelerated 6-week course, which means these exams, these topics are going to come up on you fast. Make sure you have good time management skills, and that starts right here by looking at our schedule. The most important thing for following the times and making sure that you don't fall behind is this should be finished by the end of today, or this day, I should say, and then I give you a date. This means the material that is listed should be already read. You should watch your lecture videos, and you should have your notes no later than the end of this date. So here I'm saying for section 12.1a and 12.1b, you should finish everything you need to do in this section except the WebAssign homework for Thursday, May 23rd. So these are guardrails for you to help make sure that you stay on track for this class. Now, that does not mean you have to follow this schedule. And in fact, it's actually encouraged if you can go ahead of this schedule, if you can actually do these sections before these given dates, you for sure will be on track to finish in time. But if you need extra time, or maybe you were just a procrastinator, you like to wait until the end, these are the final days that you should do any of these works. So I'm going to give this to you for every single section, and that's how you should read it from now on. So when you take a look underneath here, I'm always going to give the corresponding section for the day. Any handouts, so in this case, there's no handouts. You can find all of the corresponding ebook reading to these sections, and all of the corresponding lecture videos. And I show you where they are, and I shouldn't say show, I actually just give you where they're located. You just need to go track them down. And then at the end of every single scheduled page, again, will be graded assignments. So if there's anything that needs to be done, so like WebAssign homeworks or exams coming up, or let's just say we happen to have some kind of participation thing where you get points for doing something, you will see it down here where it says graded assignments. So you'll be able to go through for each one of these sections, and they all have the same information. I would highly suggest literally coming up to the top of the page and in your notebook, write down all of these sections that are going to be covered, and then literally just use it as a checklist. As you finish each one of these sections, you should mark it off so that way you know you've got it done and you can move on to the next section. So please make sure you understand how to read and follow along with the exam schedules, because each one of these will pop up as we move into different exams. And for those that want to work faster, you'll be able to see these exam 3, exam 4, exam number 5 schedule come much sooner than the dates that I actually have listed. All right, so that got us through our schedule. I just want to very briefly talk about our Take at Home exam number 1. I've already reached out to each and every one of you about this exams. If there were any issues about your submission, I've already talked to you about that. Just make sure that you finish all the tasks that you need to do. So what I'm going to do is this week, grade all of those exams, and I go step by step to show you how to actually do these problems. I will scan them and then return them to your email. And these are nice because this is good study material for your final exam. Our final exam is a cumulative. That means everything we cover is going to be on this final exam. So getting those exam graded back with step-by-step instructions on anything you did wrong is a useful tool. So just make sure you don't throw those out. All right, we can also talk about proctoring here. So this is just a reminder that your first proctored exam is going to be Tuesday, May 28th. That is the absolute final day that you can get your proctor approved, not found, approved. So what you need to do is fill out the top section of our agreement form. And as long as I'm talking about it, why don't we go find that? Any information about proctoring will be off here to the left where it says proctored exams information. And then I give you all the information that you need to know. So before you take a proctored exam, it'd be a good idea to go through the proctored exam information. It'll give you helpful hints. I already showed you the things you should look for proctors. So great places to look are going to be like public schools, public libraries, anything along those lines are a good place to look. A lot of you have already indicated that you're going to take your exams at Bay College itself. So you can come down here to how to schedule an exam in the testing center at Iron Mountain and Escanaba campuses. So this will give you information on how to do that. But the most important thing, again, for your proctors is this outside proctor and student agreement form. So make sure that you click and download this form. You will need to fill out the first half of this form, give it to your proctor to fill out the second half, and then if your proctor is willing to go along with all of the rules, they will send that to our testing center here at the campus. So you don't actually have to send these to me, you send them, actually you don't have to send them anywhere because it will be your proctor that does that. For anyone doing the proctoring at Iron Mountain or at Escanaba campus, you do not need to fill out one of these forms. All you need to do is schedule and show up with your exam or to your exam with your ID. So again, just make sure that you are really putting a plan of action into motion for these proctors because you want to get these done sooner than later. And a reminder that our testing center our testing center services is only open Monday through Thursday, which means even if you find your proctor Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, it will not be processed until Monday. So make sure that you get on this as soon as you can. All right, so the final piece that I want to talk about in this video is to give a brief tutorial on how to factor. So I'm going to show you the AC table method, and then I'm also going to give you the verbal method. The AC table method works every single time. So this works when A equals 1, which is a very special type of factoring called the shortcut method, and when A does not equal 1. And again, this is a very special type of factoring called the splitting method. Then the verbal method is for students that already know how to factor, but this could be a way for you to actually find those factors much quicker. And for those using the AC table method and maybe haven't factored much or haven't factored in a long time, hopefully you do get to the verbal method. But remember, you are going to be required to factor extensively in this next exam, so please make sure that your factoring is strong. So what I want to do is come over to WebAssign and we'll take a look at a few problems. So here, this is section, I believe, 11.1 to 11.4, and we're just going to take a look at some of the factoring problems and just show you how we can do this. All right, so our first problem here says factor, and we're going to take a look at number 5. So the problem it gives us is p squared minus 4p minus 32. So what we need to do is factor this down into two binomials, which is basically just saying we need two sets of parentheses multiplied by each other, and in each set of parentheses, we need two terms. So what I'm going to do here is show you how to use the AC table method. Now, it is kind of a tedious method, but it works every single time. So the first thing you need to understand with quadratic equations is that we have a general form that is ax squared plus bx plus c. So this is the general form for a quadratic, and when we start seeing the variables a, b, and c, we are taking it from this general form. A is going to be the coefficient out in front of our variable squared term. B is going to be the coefficient out in front of our variable to the first power term, and c is the final constant that is going to be on the end. So here, because we have a quadratic form that matches our standard quadratic form, this means we can identify our coefficients of a, b, and c because we're going to use these for the AC table. So what I want to do is come under my problem, and we're literally going to identify a, b, and c. A is the coefficient out in front of our variable squared. So here in our problem, we don't actually see anything out front, and if there is nothing there, it's implied to be a 1. 1 times p squared is p squared. We just don't write that multiplication in 1 in math because it's redundant. So that means here, with nothing written out in front of p squared, our coefficient is 1. And this is actually going to give us a very special meaning on how we can factor later. B is the coefficient out in front of our variable to the first power. So here in this case, we have p, and we can see the coefficient out front is -4. If you do not know what coefficients are, immediately stop and go learn them, because you're going to need coefficients throughout this entire course. And you saw this in the first exam. It's going to keep popping up. So just make sure you know how to work with coefficients. And then finally, C is just the final constant and its sign on the end. So here we can see it is -32. So we identify our A, B, and C coming from the coefficients from the general form of our quadratic, and then we're going to multiply A times C. So here, this is going to be 1 times -32, which is -32. So for the AC table method, what we want to do is literally create a table that is going to have A times C sitting over the junction where our lines meet, and we're going to have B that is off to the end. We fill in the information we found. A times C is -32. So what I'm going to do is insert this under A times C, and then we found B to be -4. So I'm going to put that information here. So this is just how we set up the AC table. The next thing we want to do is find all of the integer factors that when we multiply them together, that we get -32. So those factors would be 1 times -32 is -32, but also -1 times +32 is -32. We will get 2 times -16 is -32. -2 times +16 is -32. And then finally, we're going to get 4 times -8, and then -4 times a +8. We actually do not need to continue this list, because the next factors would be 8 times 4, and then 16 times 2, and then 32 times 1. We already have those factors, and we can use the commutative property that says it does not matter which order we actually multiply in. So notice that when we come up with these factors, they're always going to show up in pairs. So you need to make sure that you're accounting for both sets of numbers and their signs that will multiply to give you -32. So once you have found all of the factors for A times C, now what we want to do is actually take the pairs of factors we found and literally just add them together. We will take the result and put it underneath our column where we have B. In this case, it's -4. So the goal is, when we add these two together, these two factors together, we want to see, can we match a number that is what our B happened to be? So let's go ahead and add these numbers. 1 plus -32 is -31. -1 plus 32 is +31. 2 plus -16 is -14. -2 plus 16 is +14. 4 plus -8 is going to be -4. And then -4 plus 8 is going to be a +4. So once again, all we're doing here is just adding the factors together to see what number we get. And then the goal here is to see, do any of these numbers match what we found for B? If they do not, first check your work. You always want to make sure that you're checking to make sure you're doing your work correctly before you actually go on with this. But if you've checked your work, let's go to the writing. If you've checked your work and you still don't find any matching numbers here, that means we have a special case of factoring where it is, quote unquote, non-factorable. And in fact, that means the problem is already factored and you can stop. But in this case, we can see that we do get something that matches. So what I'm going to do is put a box around where it matches. I noticed that when I added 4 and -8 together, it gave me -4, and this -4 matches B. This is going to tell us the numbers that we need to use when we factor. All right, so this is how we start the AC table method for both the shortcut method and the splitting method. So what am I talking about for the shortcut method and the splitting method? We will use the shortcut method when A is equal to 1. So that means we need to come back to look to see what we found for our A. And in this case, we found A equals 1. Therefore, I would use the shortcut method. So the shortcut method is literally called that because we can kind of take a shortcut to our answer. As long as A is equal to 1 and we've already found the factors we're going to use, we immediately can set up the format of our answer. And it's always going to look like this. We're going to have two sets of parentheses that are going to be multiplied together. And then if we do find any greatest common factor, which we'll talk about here in a second, we would always want to insert that in front as multiplication. So in this particular case, if we take a look at the greatest common factor, hopefully you know and understand that our greatest common factor between p squared, negative 4p, and negative 32 is just 1. So this means we would not pull out a greatest common factor, which is the first thing you must do when you factor. But because it is just a 1, when we pull out 1, it doesn't change our problem. So the format for our answer for the shortcut method just has two parentheses multiplied together with our greatest common factor multiplied out front. You will take the variable you are using in the problem, in this case it is p, and we're going to put them in the first location in each set of parentheses. And then the reason why it's called the shortcut method is because, again, A must equal 1. If A does not equal 1, you cannot use the shortcut method. But in this case, because A is equal to 1, we get to come over to the two factors we found, and we're going to take each factor and their sign, and we will insert it into the blank spaces in our parentheses. So here we had factors of positive 4 and negative 8. That means I'm going to take positive 4 and its sign, so a positive 4, and I'm going to insert it into the first blank spot. And then we also have negative 8. So I'm going to take negative 8 and insert it into our second spot. And there it is. This is our factored answer. So when we tell you to factor, this is what we are looking for. 1 times p plus 4, which is its own factor, and p minus 8, which is its own factor, turns into p plus 4 times p minus 8, and this is our factored answer. Now, the beautiful thing about factoring is you can always check your answers. And on this exam coming up, incorrect factors are going to cost you a lot of points. So here we can always check to make sure that our factors are correct. How we are going to do that is we will take the answer that we just got and we will FOIL this back out to see, do we get back the original problem? And if you do, you can be 100% sure that your factors are correct. So what we can do here is take my answer, p plus 4, times the quantity p minus 8, and what we're going to do is FOIL this out. FOIL just means first, outside, inside, and last. We're going to multiply our first terms together. We're going to multiply our outside terms together. We're going to multiply our inside terms together, and we're going to multiply our last terms together. In other words, every term in the first quantity must be multiplied by every term in the second quantity. And that variation works when we have more than two terms in each set of parentheses. So when we multiply this out, when we FOIL this out, we're going to get p times p is going to be p squared. P times negative 8 is negative 8p. 4 times p is positive 4p. And then 4 times negative 8 is negative 32. And then the final thing that we want to do is combine like terms. Like terms mean they have the same variable to the exact same power. Here we do with negative 8p and 4p. So what we end up with is p squared minus 4p minus 32. And this means this is exactly the problem that we started with. So that means we can be 100% sure that our factors are correct. Now, this is the AC table method, and it is absolutely the longest method to use. However, it works every single time. So if you are not good with factoring or do not know how to factor, which is not good for you in this particular exam because you're going to do nothing but factoring, you want to use this AC table method and practice, practice, practice until you actually get used to it. So the other thing too is just because I'm showing these methods does not mean these are the only ways that you have to factor. And in fact, if you have your own method of factoring that works, you are absolutely free to use that. So what I want to do now is show you the verbal method on how we could actually have found the exact same problem. So we're still going to be looking at number 5 here and just redo the problem using this verbal method. So for those that already know how to factor, this is something that could be a very useful tool for you to find your factors even quicker. So let's take the same problem, p squared minus 4p minus 32. And now we're going to use this verbal method. So the verbal method kind of borrows from the AC table method, except we don't actually show our work. We're actually going to say it out loud. The goal here is we want to look at the absolute value of our constant. And that's just a fancy way of saying when I take a look at C, our final constant, we're only going to look at the digits. We do not care what the sign is. So that's why here I only put a box around the number 32. I did not include the sign because in the verbal method, we don't care what sign this constant is. We're always just going to assume it's a positive sign. And then the second thing that we're going to look at is the coefficient, and again, excluding the sign on our middle term. So this is just B and C, respectively, from the AC table, except we ignore their signs, and there's going to be a reason why. So what we want to do is still, no matter what, when we factor, see if we can find and pull out a greatest common factor. That always needs to be step number 1 when you factor. Here, once again, the greatest common factor is 1, as they have no other common factor. And after we do this, if you can pull out a greatest common factor, pull it out and then factor the remaining parts. So make sure that A is equal to 1 to be able to use the shortcut method. If A is not equal to 1, you're going to be required to use the splitting method, which I will show here in a little bit. But now that A is equal to 1, we can actually use this verbal method. And this is how it goes. So we are going to take a look at the two numbers we found, 32 and 4. This is how we're going to say this. I need two integer factors of 32 that have a sum or difference of 4. So I'm going to say it again. So notice we do not include the signs. It doesn't matter that they're negatives out front. We're just going to assume those negative signs aren't there. We need two integer factors of 32 that have a sum or difference of 4. So when you think of your factors of 32 and you run through them, and in fact, we can see them over here. When we take the two factors of 32, 8 and 4, because 8 times 4 is 32, so those are two factors of 32, and we subtract them, we get 4. We need two factors of 32 that have a sum or difference of 4. Those two factors are going to be 4 and 8. So because A is 1, we are inferring the shortcut method. We get to jump right to the format of our answer, which is going to be two parentheses multiplied together. Any greatest common factor would really be out front. But now all we need to do is take the variable we are using in the problem and put it out front. The last thing we need to do is come up with the signs that we need. So this is how this works and can save you some time. The only way our middle term is a negative value is if the biggest number is negative. And this will work every single time as long as you say it that way. The only way that my middle term, and my middle term here is the opposite of 4p, is a negative sign means my biggest number must be negative. And if this was positive instead, what we would say is the only way my middle term is positive is if my biggest number is positive. Now, what happens if both numbers are exactly the same? Turns out it even works there. If you have the same numbers, let's just assume both of these were 4 for just a second, you still say the same thing. The only way I get a negative middle term is if my biggest number is negative. Well, if they're both the biggest number, they're both negative. And the same thing would work for positive. I will show this again because repetition is the way to go. So once we have this, now we need to take a look at our constant and its term. The only way that we get a negative, and in this case, what would be C, this is just the constant on the end. The only way we get a negative C value is if the signs in our parentheses are opposite each other, because positive times a negative or negative times a positive would give you a negative. So because we found this to be a negative, by default, this must be positive. So I did talk a lot, and that was a lot of wordage, but I want you to understand how this works. So let's very quickly show how it's done. We would take a look at the problem and just don't even worry about the signs. We're just going to assume all signs are positive. We need two factors of 32 that have a sum or difference of 4. Those two factors are 4 and 8. Because A is equal to 1, we get to use the shortcut method, which lets us set up the format of our answer. Plug in the variable you're using in the first term, and then to find the signs, we literally would take a look at the middle term. The only way our middle term is negative is if our biggest number between 4 and 8 is negative. And then we would take a look at the final constant C. The only way I get a negative value of C is if these are opposite signs. So that's why if this is negative, this must be positive. I promise this method becomes much, much faster, and eventually you actually start doing it in your head. And again, if you already know how to do this, just keep using your own method of factoring. And in fact, there's a good chance that if you already know how to factor, you didn't make it this far into the video, which is fine because you're actually already expected to know how to factor coming into this class. And again, if you don't know how to factor, you need to learn immediately because our second exam is nothing but factoring. And then we do see factoring pop up in later exams as well. All right. So same thing here. You could check your work by foiling this back out, but notice that's the same thing here. We end up with the same problem. And when you foil your answer out and you get back the original problem, that's how you can be 100% sure that you've got the correct factors. All right, so there's an example of the AC table and our verbal method for factoring when A is equal to 1. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at a problem where A is not equal to 1, and we can show you the splitting method. So let's come back over to the computer. I'm going to scroll down. Let's take a look at example number 8. So number 8, we are given a new problem. It is 2y squared plus 11y plus 5. And again, what we want to do is factor this completely. So what you should always do, and it doesn't matter what method you are using, is you should always identify your greatest common factor and what A is. So here, my greatest common factor between 2, 11, 5, and then y squared wide, and then no y at all, once again, is a greatest common factor of 1. We cannot pull out anything. And just a reminder, the very first thing you must do when you factor is find and pull out a greatest common factor if possible. I see way too many times my students not do that step, which is a big issue. So the next thing we want to do is identify our A. Our A is just the coefficient out in front of our variable squared, which in this case is 2. This is not equal to 1, so you cannot use the shortcut method. And in fact, we have to use the splitting method. So I'm going to use the AC table again to show you how to use the splitting method. And again, it's the longest possible way. You are not required to use this. This is just recommended for students that do not know how to factor. So what we're going to do is identify our A, our B, and our C again. A is the coefficient out in front of y squared, which is 2. B is the coefficient and its sign out in front of y is 11. And then C is the final constant on the end, which is a positive 5. So what we want to do is multiply A times C. So we get 2 times 5 is going to be equal to 10. Set up your AC table. So what we want to do is literally just draw our T table here. A times C goes over the junction of the lines, and we found this to be a positive 10. You must keep the sign with it as well. And then here our B ended up being 11, positive 11. We go through the same process. We're going to find all of the integer factors that when we multiply them together give us 10. So here we're going to have 1 times negative, I don't know why I wrote a negative there. It's going to be a positive 10. So 1 times positive 10 actually gives us 10, but we also need to use the other pair as well. Negative 1 times negative 10 is also a positive 10. So again, these are always going to come in pairs, and make sure you don't make the mistake I almost made. Make sure that when you multiply them together, you not only get the number, but you get the sign as well. So the only other 2 integer factors we can use is 2 times 5 and negative 2 times negative 5. And we still add up these factors and see if any of them match to 11. So right away, when I go ahead and add my first 2 factors, we can see we already get a match. And at that point, you can stop. But I'm just going to show you that when we add up the rest of these, none of the others add up to 11 as well. So the factors we are going to use for this problem are going to be a positive 1 and a positive 10. However, this is where the difference comes when A is not equal to 1. Because A is equal to 2, we must use the splitting method, which means we no longer can just write the format of our answer. We actually must split the middle term into 2 pieces. So what do I mean by that? In our problem, we have our middle term, which is 11y. We are literally going to split this one term into 2 terms, and then we will factor by grouping. So one thing you should always do if you're ever in this case is simply rewrite the problem. That is going to help you out when it comes to organizing what you need to do. Then what we want to do is take our middle term, and we are actually going to split this into 2 pieces. The 2 pieces we are going to use are going to be the variable, and then we use the factors that we found as coefficients on those variables. So 2y squared and 5 are not changing, so we keep them the same, 2y squared. Now when we want to split 11y into 2 pieces, we're going to take the coefficient of 1 and put it on the variable we're using y. So it's a positive 1, so I'm going to get a positive 1y. And then we're going to do the same thing for the other piece, which in this case is a positive 10. So we can also take a positive using its sign plus 10, the coefficient, on the variable y, and then finish it off by still adding 5 on the end. So this is the splitting method. We literally take our middle term in the problem and we split it into 2 pieces. Those 2 pieces will be the 2 factors we found as coefficients on the variable in the problem, which in this case is y. And now we are going to factor by grouping. So what we want to do is take the first 2 terms and group them inside of parentheses. And then we are always going to add the second 2 terms and their signs in parentheses. We will never have a negative sign between the 2 parentheses at this step. So factor by grouping just means we're going to pull the greatest common factor out of each one of these sets of parentheses. So my greatest common factor of 2y squared and y is going to be y. So 2y squared divided by y is going to be 2y. Y divided by y is 1, not 0, not nothing. They cancel to 1. We still have addition in the middle, and then we do the same thing over here. We're going to find this greatest common factor. 10y and 5, our greatest common factor would be y, so we pull that out front. 10y divided by 5 is 2y, and then 5 divided by 5 is, once again, a positive 1. The whole point of factor by grouping is to make sure that we get 2 factors that are the same. Make sure you understand the difference between your terms and your factors. We have terms inside of factors inside of a term. So in at this stage right here, we actually only have 2 terms. This is one term, and this is another term. Make sure you know the difference between terms and factors. Y is a factor. 2y plus 1 is its own factor. 5 is a factor. 2y plus 1 is its own factor. So the final thing that we want to do here is pull out a greatest common factor one more time of our two terms, and we do share a factor of 2y plus 1. So we literally pull that out front as the greatest common factor, and then we divide both terms. Y times y, 2y plus 1, divided by 2y plus 1. These factors cancel. We're left with just y. And then we do the same thing over here. We're going to have 5 times 2y plus 1 divided by 2y plus 1. 2y plus 1, those cancel, or excuse me, those factors cancel. We're left with just positive 5. And there it is. This would be our final factored answer. And if we did have a greatest common factor, we would actually slap that out front as multiplication. But because here our greatest common factor is 1, it doesn't really make a difference. Same thing as always. Check your factoring. It does not take much time, and it will save you a lot of points coming up on this exam. So all we need to do now is just foil this back across and see, do we get back our original problem? If we do, you know you have the correct factors. So here, 2y times y is going to be 2y squared. 2y times 5 is going to be 10y. 1 times y is a positive y. 1 times 5 is a positive 5. And then the final piece that we need to do is just combine like terms. Like terms have the same variable to the same power. 10y plus y is going to end up being 11y. And what we see is we get back the original problem that we started with. So this is how you can always check your work. And this is how you can use the AC table to solve for factoring every single time. It works every single time. The difference is you must know the difference between when A is going to be equal to 1, where we get to use the shortcut method, and when A does not equal 1. If it does not equal 1, you are required to use the splitting method or any method that you already know how to do. And again, if you already know how to factor, there's a good chance you never made it this far into the video. In fact, at this point, if you're still watching, there's a good chance that you're just not very good with your factoring or you don't know how to factor. Make sure you utilize this, because once again, our exam coming up, exam number 2, is very, very heavy on factoring, and you just need to know how to do it. But at the exact same time, you actually were expected to already know how to factor coming into this class, but I know that's not the case for everyone. So this is why I wanted to give you an exhaustive list, actually show you how to go through and do this using the AC table method. All right, so there is one final piece of factoring that I do want to look at very quickly, and this is the difference of squares. So when we are talking about, and I got to quit moving away from my microphone here, when we talk about the difference of squares, this is a special factorization, and you need to know how to do the difference of squares because you're going to see it all the time in this class. So first things first, let's go and find a difference of squares problem, and we can take a look at number 12. So here we are given a squared minus 64. So what you're going to need to do is learn how to recognize, like visually recognize when we see the difference of squares. This is in fact the difference of squares, even though we don't see two numbers that are squared. We're going to use a trick that you're actually going to use a lot in this class, in that we can rewrite a number using exponents. So we can actually rewrite the number 64 as 8 squared. 8 squared is 8 times 8, which is 64. And when we rewrite this, this allows us to actually visually see the difference of squares. The difference means subtraction, and squares literally mean a power of 2. So we see the difference, the subtraction of 2 squares. This is the difference of squares. So how this works is we get a squared minus b squared, and it's completely coincidental that these variables are the same. And this is going to equal a plus b times a minus b. And again, this is something we just need to commit to memory. So this means if we can actually find a and b in this problem, that is going to allow us to be able to immediately substitute them in, and we will have the difference of squares. So how we find a and b is we look at this version right here. After we rewrite this number as a number squared, we can find our a, which is going to be our first term without the square on it. So a, ironically here in this case, is a, and again, that's coincidental. It can be any other variable, like an x. A would be x if this was x squared minus 64. And then we can find b by looking at the base without the exponent, without the sign. In this case, it's just 8. So this means a is a, b is 8. All we need to do now is just substitute it into the form for the difference of squares. So we would get a plus 8 times a minus 8. This would be the factors for the difference of squares of a squared minus 64. And again, as always, you can check your factoring by just foiling this back out. What we would see is a times a is going to be a squared. A times negative 8 is negative 8a. 8 times a is going to be positive 8a. 8 times negative 8 is negative 64. And then what we see here is we have like terms in the middle. 8a minus 8a is 0a, or simply just 0. And what we get back is a squared minus 64, which is the original problem. So once again, you just have to be very strong with your factoring in this particular exam, and you also need to know how to solve equations by factoring. So let's go ahead and just take the same exact problem. I'll substitute x this time. Let's go x squared minus 64 is now going to be equal to 0. So what we can do is use what is called the zero factor property. That says we need to get nothing but factors on one side and set it equal to 0. Well, these are terms, not factors. This is the difference of squares. So what you would want to do is factor this out using the difference of squares, which in this case would be x plus 8 and then x minus 8. Since we have an equal sign in the problem, we actually can assign a number to x itself. And what we want to do to use the zero factor property is, once again, we need nothing but factors on one side. X plus 8 is its own factor. X minus 8 is its own factor. So we have nothing but factors on the left side. And this needs to be set equal to 0. So all you need to do to solve for x is set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So once again, x plus 8 is its own factor. We're going to set that equal to 0. And then x minus 8 is equal to 0. And we're going to set that factor equal to 0 and solve. So all you need to do is just get x by itself. Here we can subtract 8 from both sides of the equation. On the other side, all we have to do is add 8 to both sides of the equation, and we would get back both of our answers. X equals a negative 8 and x equals a positive 8. Same thing, you can check your answer by simply substituting these values back into the equation. Whenever you substitute in a math class, you should always substitute using parentheses. So that means here, if I want to substitute negative 8 back, we actually have negative 8 in parentheses squared minus 64 is equal to 0, because there is a huge difference between negative 8 squared without parentheses and negative 8 squared with parentheses. Without, you must do the order of operations first, which says you have to do exponents before multiplication, and a negative sign is a multiplication of negative 1. So you would need to do this exponent first. That would give us negative 64 for an answer. We're down below, negative 8 in parentheses would just be negative 8 times negative 8, which is a positive 64. So the point is, just make sure you always substitute using parentheses in a math class. Negative 8 squared in parentheses is going to be 64 minus 64, which is 0. 0 equals 0. You can be 100% sure that you've got the correct factors. So one more time, you need to make sure that you know how to factor very well in this class, especially for exam number 2. If you do not know how to factor, you're going to do very poorly on this exam. So make sure you take the time necessary to learn how to factor. The AC table works every single time. Hopefully you can get to the verbal method. So let's take a look at our to-do list. So if I can find the button, there it is. We want to make sure that you look over the exam number 2 schedule. It's going to show you all the sections you need to learn, and I give you timelines on when you should learn them. But our due dates are hard due dates, which means that is the final day that you are allowed to take that exam. You are encouraged to do it sooner if you can, but you don't have to. If you want to take your exam on the exact exam due date, that is fine as well. It's just once you start taking or turning in exams after that due date, you start losing points. Let's see what else. You need to get going on finding your proctor. If you haven't done so already, you really need to get going because you will need a proctor for 1 week from today, Tuesday, May 28th. If you do not have a proctor by that time, you cannot take the exam and you will get a 0. So again, make sure that you fill out the form, the top part of the form, give it to your potential proctor to fill out the final part of the form, and then your proctor will send that to our testing services. You do not need to send anything for that proctor sheet. And then finally, know how to factor. You got to know how to factor in this class. Know what to do when A equals 1, which is the shortcut method. Know what to do when A doesn't equal 1, which is the splitting method, where we literally split our middle term into 2 pieces. And then of all the special products, you need to know how to work with and identify the difference of squares. So I know this was a long video, but this is more intended for those that just really didn't know how to didn't know how to factor correctly. And that's the only reason you make it to the end of this video. So if you're in that case, don't give up. It's a very frustrating thing, but math is all about repetition. Once you learn how to do it once, you just need to do it again and again and again and again and again until you actually understand what you're doing. And using that AC table method, yes, it takes forever to do the first time. The more times you do it, you get a little bit faster and you get a little bit quicker and a little bit quicker. And before you know it, you can finish the problem in like a minute. And hopefully you get to the point where you don't even have to use the AC table method at all. So again, there it is. Make sure that you know how to work with our Blackboard course and watch the schedule. It will update as we get closer to exams. But the first things first, make sure you're looking at the correct things for exam number 2, which is a proctored exam for next Tuesday, May 28th. All right, that's all I got for you in this video. We will see you in the next one.